Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving into a super fascinating dynamic: how 17th century British chaos acted just like a massive stone dropped right into a pond. It created these huge, disruptive waves that crashed all the way across the Atlantic and right into the American colonies. It's really a story of how instability at home forces a heavy hand abroad.
Okay, let's dive right into our agenda. We're going to trace a nearly 70-year timeline of regime-toppling history. We'll start with a century of turmoil, move through the Civil War and Republic, see how the imperial grip tightened, look at the Dominion of New England, and finally unpack the Glorious Revolution. So, Part 1, a century of turmoil. We're starting in 16th century England. To really get what was happening in the colonies, we have to set the stage in Europe first. This era was completely defined by intense religious friction. While Spain was out there building this vast global empire in the New World, England was totally consumed by internal strife. You had Catholic and Protestant monarchs locked in this bitter, bloody struggle for supremacy, just constantly attacking their political opponents as heretics. And even when Queen Elizabeth eventually established a religious settlement to make Protestantism the official religion, the tensions, they were far from resolved. The structural foundations of the nation were deeply, deeply fractured. And reacting to that fractured foundation, we have these godly Protestants, whose critics actually dubs them Puritans. They felt the new Church of England still held on to way too many Catholic ceremonies and practices. Basically, they wanted a cleaner break. So in the 1620s and 30s, large numbers of these dissenters made a truly monumental decision. They packed up and traveled across the ocean to the New World, hoping to build a truly godly community from scratch, totally far away from the compromises of the English crown. Which brings us to Section 2, Civil War and Republic, focusing on the turbulent 1640s. By the 1640s, those long-simmering religious tensions violently collided with political and economic conflicts. What we're looking at here is a pivotal moment. King Charles I, wearing that blue sash, conferring with his commanders right before the first battle of the English Civil War in 1642. By this point, all compromises between the king and Parliament had completely broken down. This battle kicked off years of bloody civil wars across England, Scotland, Wales, and Ireland. Ultimately, it led to Charles's absolute defeat and his unprecedented execution for treason in 1649, which paved the way for Oliver Cromwell to take control of a new English protectorate. Now, the crucial point here is how this massive shockwave hit the colonies, because their loyalties were severely split. Down in the Chesapeake, the political and economic elite deeply sympathized with the crown. Meanwhile, those religious dissenters up in New England, well, naturally, they favored Parliament. The colonies desperately tried to remain officially neutral, to avoid being dragged into a devastating war. Even Massachusetts Bay played it safe. But Charles's execution? That absolutely shattered that neutrality. Right after the king's execution, 6 colonies, including Virginia and Barbados, openly rebelled and declared their allegiance to the dead monarch's son, Charles II. And Parliament's response? They dropped an ideological hammer in 1650. They declared that because the American colonies had been planted at the cost and settled by the English nation, Parliament inherently possessed ultimate jurisdiction over them. Basically, they were asserting, in no uncertain terms, that they owned the colonies. And listen, Parliament didn't just use strong words. They took really aggressive, concrete steps to force assimilation and obedience. First, they slapped a harsh economic embargo on the rebelling colonies in 1650. Then, they followed it up the very next year with the Navigation Act of 1651. This act explicitly forced merchants in every single colony to ship their goods directly to England, using only English ships. It was this calculated move to bind the colonies closer and strategically block out European rivals, especially the Dutch, from interfering with American wealth. Moving on to Section 3, tightening the imperial grip, the Restoration. By the late 1650s, the political landscape shifted yet again. Oliver Cromwell died, and by 1660, the English monarchy was officially back in business. Here is King Charles II arriving in Rotterdam, getting ready to sail back to England on his 30th birthday in May 1660. After 9 long years in exile, he was welcomed in London with massive acclaim. This marks the beginning of the period we call the Restoration. But for the American colonists, the return of the king did not mean a return to being left alone. Not at all. Actually, Charles II immediately pivoted to even tighter imperial integration and economic extraction. He used 3 really specific methods of control. First, he granted new proprietary colonies directly to his royal favorites.
Second, he doubled down on those economic restrictions by imposing even more navigation acts. And crucially, he established a brand new executive council, known as the Lords of Trade and Plantations, to actively manage and profit from this growing empire. The reins were definitely getting tighter.
Okay, Section 4, the Dominion of New England. James II takes over.
So, following Charles II's death in 1685, the situation in the colonies went from being strictly managed to feeling absolutely suffocating under his brother James. Take a look at this imposing armor in this portrait of James II. He brought with him an open admiration for absolutist French-style rule. That, combined with his Catholicism, absolutely terrified both the English parliamentarians back home and the American colonists abroad, who deeply, deeply feared arbitrary power.
And James? He wasted no time imposing radical imperial reforms. In 1686, he created the Dominion of New England. Now, this was a massive administrative unit that completely consolidated New York, New Jersey, and the New England colonies into one giant block. Ostensibly, the Crown claimed this was just to counter the military threat from French Canada. But to the English colonists, it felt like an immediate and totally devastating loss of their local autonomy and self-governance.
The harsh reality of this new absolute rule really hit home in 1687. The Dominion's newly appointed governor, Sir Edmund Andros, basically forced colonists into military service for a campaign against Native Americans in Maine. For the colonists, this was the ultimate breaking point. Being forced into military service by an unelected governor? That completely symbolized the terrifying imposition of arbitrary power on a people who fundamentally believed themselves to be free.
Which brings us to our final part, Section 5. The Glorious Revolution, a historic turning point.
So, back in England, James II's Catholic absolutism pushed Parliament way too far, setting the stage for a massive historic turning point. But before we get into that, just appreciate the absolute whiplash the colonists were enduring from afar. Look at this timeline. 1649, a king is executed. 1653, a military protectorate takes over. 1660, the monarchy is restored. And then 1685, an absolutist takes the throne. After nearly half a century of this relentless political turbulence, it is no wonder the colonists were incredibly anxious about who was actually in charge across the Atlantic.
Well, the breaking point in England finally arrived in 1688 with what became known as the Glorious Revolution. Parliament essentially orchestrated a coup, offering the throne to James's Protestant daughter Mary and her Dutch husband Prince William. When William showed up with a massive fleet, James fled to France. It was a mostly bloodless change of power in England, and it resulted in the 1689 Bill of Rights. This was huge. It secured a Protestant succession, established the individual rights of English subjects, and permanently cemented legislative supremacy for Parliament over the Crown. The colonial reaction to this news, initially explosive. Even though imperial authorities tried to keep 1688 a secret, word got out, and it sparked popular uprisings against colonial administrators in Boston, New York City, and Maryland. Now, while those rebellions were quickly suppressed, the colonial governments soon gladly declared their allegiance to William and Mary. For free colonists, the revolution really did feel glorious. It united them within a powerful Protestant empire standing strong against the Catholic tyranny and absolutism they felt was embodied by France.
This new political system, established in 1689, actually maintained relative peace and order for nearly a century. But I want to leave you with this really provocative thought to ponder. If the Glorious Revolution so successfully united the colonies in England under a shared system, how did this very framework ultimately sow the seeds for the explosive American Revolution in the 1770s? What deep-seated desires for true autonomy were merely bandaged over by this temporary unity? Thank you so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep questioning the ripples of history.